Cool. Well, that's 4 o'clock. So I just got to say, welcome everybody, and yeah, welcome to the first Changing Planet seminar of the academic year. This seminar is going to be addressing the topic of reaching net zero, our progress so far, and the challenges ahead. And will be hosted by the Grantham Institute here at Imperial. Stay up to date with our latest activities. We're going to plug our newsletter and our social media, which Ben will post in the chat just now. And myself and Ben were the seminar reps this year for the GTP and the Grantham Institute. And I'm Patrick, and I'll be chairing this this first event with you now. So today's focus will be on UK's transition to net zero emissions, the reasons for the UK's progress with reducing emissions so far, and some of the challenges ahead and what will be required in the future, particularly as we look forward to COP26 and in the climate conference, but also looking at the Prime Minister's recent 10-point plan that was announced last week, and the spending review that was announced today. So we are joined by Professor Jim Watson, who's a Professor of Energy Policy and Research Director at the Institute of Sustainable Resources at UCL. He frequently advises UK government departments and other organisations, and has been a specialist advisor with 3 UK parliamentary committees. He also has extensive experience, including over 10 years working on energy scenarios and energy innovation policies in China and India, and a period as a visiting scholar at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He's a judge for the Queen Awards on Sustainable Development, a member of the UK government's fossil fuel price projection expert panel, and was an expert lead with the Climate Assembly UK, the UK's National Citizens Assembly on climate change. And we hear some of the results that from that in this talk today. So before I hand over to Jim, got a few housekeeping rules that need to mention. So just so you're all aware, the event is going to be recorded and will be posted on social media and the Grantham page after the seminar. And other than that, you joined the seminar muted and with your video on. Please do ensure that you remain muted for the duration of the seminar. There will be an opportunity to unmute yourself at the end if you would like to ask any questions. Which leads on quite nicely to that if you do have any questions during the seminar, please just write them down in the chat, and you'll have an opportunity to ask them at the end, or then I can ask them on your behalf. And then finally, there are a couple of Slido polls that are going to be presented during the presentation. Ben will post the link to that in the chat so that when we get there, we'll avoid the faff of having to open up your browser and get everything sorted. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jim, who will be talking to us about reaching net zero. And I say thank you and welcome to Jim.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for the kind introduction, and to you and your colleagues at Imperial at the Grantham Institute for organising this and for inviting me. And welcome everybody. Thank you to so many of you for giving up your time to join this, and hope you find it useful. And we have some good question and answers towards the end, which is always the most interesting bit for me. So I'll just get my slides going. And make sure you can see those. So I'm hoping you can see it all. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something which is, pretty topical. Of course, for many of you, it's related to things you're working on, which is basically how the UK is going to meet its share of tackling climate change, and particularly reaching the target that was legislated last year of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So, the UK's done quite well in the past in terms of reducing emissions for all kinds of reasons, but as the title of the talk suggests, there are a lot of challenges ahead. Those aren't just challenges for the UK, they are challenges that many countries share too. And clearly, all the way through this, particularly over the last 6 months, there's additional challenges to deal with, especially the impact of COVID-19 on all of our lives. And there continues really to be a lively debate about how that impact of that pandemic might impact, in turn, reaching our net zero target? Will it help or will it not? And I'll have some thoughts about that along the way. As Patrick mentioned, one of the things I've done recently is being one of 4 expert leads with the National Assembly, Citizens Assembly on Climate Change. That reported in September. So I thought it'd be interesting to share some of the results with you as I go through the talk. I'm not giving you the full set of results. And so if you're interested in what the Assembly found, I'd really encourage you to look at their full report, because actually what I'm going to show you is a few snapshots and they're taken out of context. And they make a lot more sense when you look at them alongside their full set of results. And that's all on the Climate Assembly UK website, which you can find quite easily. So I'll now move on. So kind of what I'm going to talk about first is the context we're in and where we've come from, but also then move on to talk about, as the title says, the challenges ahead. So, there's a lot of discussion in the UK and globally about the energy transition, the transition towards hopefully a more sustainable, a more low carbon, if not zero carbon energy system in countries around the world. I always feel it's often talked about as if it's something that's going to happen in the future. And as I'll show you in a minute, the UK is actually well on the way through its energy transition already, especially if you think about reducing emissions. It's not that means that it's going to be an easy ride from now on. In fact, we've probably done the easier bits of the energy transition so far, but it's not all ahead of us. There is some of the energy transition behind us, so we're part way through that. But as this slide shows, there's all sorts of things going on which will affect that transition. On the left-hand side, I've got the Committee on Climate Change report. That's the recommendation to go to net zero from last year. And then more recently from last week, the 10-point plan, which is, the government responded formally to the net zero report, but this is their first, I guess, comprehensive and substantive response in terms of a set of plans for at least getting us further towards that net zero goal. So I'll talk more about that as I go along. But at the same time, there's all sorts of other things happening, often that are influenced by international changes. So one, of course, is COVID-19, which I've already mentioned, and that's had an impact on energy markets in the shorter term. So as the Financial Times headline shows, in the middle of last summer, oil prices went extremely low because of very low demand, because of lockdowns in many countries. They've since rebounded. So there's lots of things going on in that traditional part of the energy system that's affecting fossil fuel markets. And at the same time, and actually stretching much further back, there's been quite a revolution in terms of the technologies that are supplying the newer and low carbon energy systems. So the falls in costs of wind and solar and other technologies. And that's exemplified by that Guardian article, which warns you that it's more than a year old, but actually the message there is still quite current. We're going to have more of these kind of headlines to come as the cost of wind and some of the technologies continue. So there's been a lot of things going on, some of it helpful to transition and some of it not so helpful, such as the immediate impact of the pandemic on government budgets. So what has been the story so far? What have we achieved? So these are a couple of pictures from the Committee on Climate Change. The Climate Change Committee, they're the government's official advisors. They're there to advise on carbon budgets and targets that we need to meet in the UK, but also to monitor progress. And every year they publish a progress report in, I think it was July this year. And these are a couple of charts. One on the left shows, this is something the government itself liked to trumpet, the fact that at least until very recently, our GDP, our economy has been growing. That's the blue line. But at the same time, we've been reducing emissions. So the red line is the measure that most countries use, territorial emissions from within our borders. And so they've fallen around 40% if you include international aviation and shipping. If you don't include those things, it's about 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So we're not quite halfway to net zero, but certainly not far off. The green line there is interesting because that shows us what our emissions are if we count all the products and services we consume that might be made in other countries. And there's an ongoing debate about which measure is the best one to use, but the official one is the red one. And then on the right-hand side, the committee decomposed this and said what's going on in different sectors to show you which ones are really changing and which ones aren't. So the big changes, you can see the red line and the brown line, and they've changed for very different reasons. So the red line is power. So we've seen a big shift away from coal. We hardly use any coal in the power sector to generate our electricity now, but also a growth in renewables. So the proportion of low carbon electricity is starting to rise as well. So they've led to a very big drop in emissions, because the fossil fuel we're still using is the less carbon intensive one, gas. Natural gas, as the industry calls it, fossil gas, as other people have started to call it, to distinguish it from biogas and that kind of thing. Industry has also reduced. Now that's different. It's partly efficiency gains in industry emissions, and they've led to falls, but there's also been restructuring. So some industries have got smaller because goods and services are being supplied from other countries rather than the UK. So there's some efficiency, there's some new technology, and there's some restructuring in that story. But then if you look at some of the other sectors, particularly surface transport in the sort of teal color there, emissions there are pretty flat. There haven't been a lot of gains or losses, and it's been a stubbornly high level of emissions. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Some falls in buildings, and then the bright turquoise line, I think, is waste emissions. So that's fallen quite fast. And then there's other things there, which you can find in the committee's report, if you wish. So the trends are different in different sectors. COVID-19, and again, this is from the Committee on Climate Change, had a very big short-term impact on emissions. And you can see that here, and actually they helpfully decompose it by activity. So because we were not flying and because we were driving a lot less, in April, May, June especially, there was big drops in UK emissions, but also from industry, and a bit of a rise in April, May, because we're still heating our homes at that point. It was quite cold in April. And so there's a bit of a rise in residential emissions. But those effects are starting to wear off. Even with the more recent lockdown we're still in, the impact is much less because it's much less strict. And so in many countries, and the IEA, the International Energy Agency, bore this out when they published their annual assessment a couple of weeks ago, in the end, emissions are going to rebound. They may rebound in a year, they may rebound in 2 years, but without extra action to reduce those emissions through climate policy, all we're doing is reducing emissions very temporarily and then going back to the way we were. So it's not necessarily an answer to the climate challenge. It perhaps gives us breathing space to think about what policies we want to put in place, of course. I think the other contextual point is that, having a net zero target means it's really changed the game in all kinds of ways. So we have to reduce emissions across the economy and also think about removing emissions from the atmosphere as well, because some emissions are very hard to reduce, like from aviation or agriculture, reduced to zero at least. So, there's a need to think about the analysis tools we use. And I'm just giving an example here of a paper I was involved in with a lot of colleagues from I think there's some Imperial College colleagues there and UCL and so on, really thinking about the analysis tools we use to analyze energy systems and how they might change. And there's a lot of work needed to upgrade those so they can actually cope with a net zero scenario. Because what colleagues found was that if you tried to do net zero with the existing tool as it was, it simply couldn't do it. It needed you to add imagined technologies which could remove a lot of emissions from the atmosphere in order to balance the carbon budget. So there's a lot of work now to develop new tools or extend the ones we have in order to meet net zero and try and advise governments and other organizations of how to do that. So that's just another point to make there. So in terms of where we need to go then, so changing gear from where we've gone to where we need to go. This again is from the Committee on Climate Change. This is from the net zero target advice that they published last year. And basically what it shows is the residual emissions that they think we might end up with if we do all the things that they think we should do across industry, transport, power sector, etc., and agriculture. So that's the residual emissions on the left. You can see that's very much dominated by those difficult sectors, land use, agriculture and aviation, but then quite a lot from other sectors as well. And then on the right-hand side, well, how do you balance those out? Because they've got to be removed if we're going to reach net zero within the UK's borders, which is what their advice was. So there's quite a lot of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So that's burning bioenergy resources, capturing the carbon, storing it long-term underground. But they've also got this dotted boxes, which is technologies yet to be determined, or more tree planting, maybe direct air capture, which is further into the future. So it shows you where they think we need to be in 2050. And what it means for some of those sectors that I've talked about already, the ones which emit a lot of our emissions at the moment, is that they're really going to very low levels. So power from 65 million tons in 2018 to about 3 in 2050, buildings from 88 to 4, surface transport, that one that hasn't changed very much, from 115 to 2. So that just gives you a sense of the, the amount of work that still needs to be done, particularly in buildings and transport, where we haven't seen the kind of progress we've seen in the power sector. So this is an energy graph, velocity graph. There's often a habit of talking about electricity when we talk about net zero and climate change and energy, partly because that's where a lot of the action has been, but partly because, at least until recently, we didn't focus as much on things like heating and industry and transport as part of that big picture. So you can see our energy picture has changed, as I've already said. We've got a doubling of the share of low carbon energy to about 20%. So overall energy, it's about 20%, 50% of power generation. Coal has almost disappeared, but you've still got very big chunks of oil and gas across the transport, across heating, across industry. So that just, again, reinforces all the things that still need to change to meet net zero. So how do we get there? I'm going to go into the specific sectors in a minute, but overall, and it's probably true at Imperial College as it is at UCL and in some of the discussions you're all involved in, we often have a very technological conversation about how we're going to get there. And clearly that's for a good reason. We need to deploy different technologies. We need different technologies for power. We need technologies to retrofit buildings, which is in the middle there at the top. We need heat pumps, which is the air conditioner unit style device you can see next to the building. Many of us need to adopt electric vehicles. In fact, you're not going to be able to buy a conventional vehicle from 2030. But maybe we also need to decarbonize whole industrial clusters. That's something the 10-point plan talked about at the bottom right. I don't have a picture of one of those, so that's more of an artist's impression. And then direct air capture, that's a direct air capture trial machine at the top right there. So a lot of technology needs to be either deployed if it's mature, like solar and wind, or scaled up and made commercial and cheaper, of course, for people and industry to be able to afford them. But that's not the only kind of transition we need to make. There's another sort of transition as well. And that's where I want to introduce the Climate Assembly to you. So what the Climate Assembly was trying to do, it was commissioned by 6 select committees from the House of Commons in the UK. So they're cross-party committees of members of Parliament who scrutinise government policy. And they commissioned this assembly. It was made up of 108 citizens from across the UK. They are representative, or were representative of the UK. So in other words, they have the same spread of ages, of genders, of ethnicities, of geographical locations where they live, of attitudes to climate change, of income, and a whole set of other characteristics. So they were generally representative of the UK population at large. And the idea was really to ask them, of course, give them a lot of evidence, to ask them to advise on how to meet this net zero target by 2050. And I think that what that illustrates is that there's a social journey to go on too. That's a social journey which is about what people buy in their everyday lives and how they use technology, or what kind of transport choices they make, but also people having a say in that pathway. So the Climate Assembly was part of the answer to how do you give people that say. But then there's all sorts of other things that need to change, whether they be government policies or institutions or business models and so on. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make here is that it's a technical story, yes, but it's also an economic story, a financial story, an institutional story, and a social story. And all of those things need to change in one way or another, and they're related. On the right-hand side, although it's in French, for those of you who know French, this is Citizens Assembly on climate change, their timeline. They've also reported this year. That was commissioned by the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, and they gave their recommendations directly to him. So it's just to illustrate that other countries too are using this kind of approach to ask citizens how we should meet net zero. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the Climate Assembly later on, but I just wanted to introduce what it was about first. Okay. So how are we doing? So what's the assessment of where we are right now in terms of what we need to achieve in order to hit that net zero target? So I'm going to start with the big picture. This is again from the Committee on Climate Change. I think they do it as well as anybody because it's their job. is basically assessing where we are in terms of policies to meet that net zero. So they came up with this really handy dashboard. Green means that things are progressing pretty well. Orange is in development, and red is a policy gap where things aren't moving or there's nothing being done. So they've got a whole set of cross-coordination things, and then they've got specific policies for specific sectors, some where they're going quite well and others not so well. So I'll return to that in a minute, but it gives you a sort of snapshot of where we think they think we are in terms of our progress so far. And that's where I want to bring in the 10-point plan that many of you will have heard about, if not read, last week. That was published last. I've put in the quote from Boris Johnson here, where he launched it. It's not a comprehensive plan in terms of all the details and the budgets and so on, although there are some money commitments in there. Some of them new and some of them are re-announced. They were already commitments and they've just been re-announced in here and brought together. But also, I think the way it was framed is really interesting, that the government's really trying to both emphasize the job creation potential, not surprisingly, given the state the economy is in and is likely to be in for quite a long time to come. So job creation is really important, and clearly creating green jobs, the jobs we need for the future, is a really important part of that. But the other thing they really emphasize, which again has been lobbied for hard by many, is a whole UK approach, the idea that we need industrial regeneration in some of those areas which have suffered from industrial restructuring and has kind of contributed to that fall in emissions in the industry sector I showed you earlier. So thinking about the Northeast, the Midlands, Wales, the places mentioned in this quote, in terms of creating those jobs. So not just jobs anywhere, but in particular places as well. So I'll talk a bit more about the 10-point plan and what it contained as we go through the specifics. But having sort of done a quick look at it, I've now done my own update to the Committee on Climate Change. So this is a game of spot the difference now, where I've actually changed about 3 of the boxes, if you can see which ones, where I think actually there has been a substantial change because of the announcements in the 10-point plan. So the first one under transport is that the Committee on Climate Change really wanted a more ambitious date for phasing out fossil vehicles, petrol and diesel cars. That's been confirmed, so of 2030. So I've turned that box green up here. The second thing I've done is to go from a red box to an orange box on the buildings. So they said heat and building strategy, which is one of the many strategies the government is promising, but hasn't yet published. And they said, well, it must transform heating. And actually in the 10-point plan, there's an ambition about hydrogen with some money attached of trialing hydrogen in a village but maybe a town by 2030. There's a lot of ambition on heat pumps, which I'll talk about a bit later, another low carbon technology for heating, a bit more money, but also a target for 600,000 of those to be deployed by 2028. So I don't think that's fully addressed, but it's certainly more in the development category now. And then the final green one, because the Climate Assembly has actually happened and reported, I thought I should put that as a green box as well. So some movement, but I think in some of the other areas, although the 10-point plan talks about them, such as industry or hydrogen, maybe that one could go orange, but I feel that at the moment there's not quite enough detail to progress those particular areas. But we'll see next time the Committee on Climate Change pronounce what they think of these plans. So I'm now going to go through, in the sort of time I have left with a few polls, some of the specific areas. So first, electricity. As I said, that's the one where we have made quite a lot of progress. And I wanted to show you snapshots of this animation, which I think was from Drax funded research at Imperial College, but it was published in The Guardian as an animation. And it shows you basically the carbon intensity of the grid in different years. So here's 2012. Then if you roll forward to 2016, as you close some of those coal plants, replace them with gas, grow renewable energy, it's already come down quite a lot. And then if you look at 2020, at least until roughly April, May, you're already in the kind of 100 to 200 grams per kilowatt hour range. So you've come down a long way from 2012 because of the shifts I've told you about already. That will continue to go down, but I think unless we keep pushing and having the more investment in those technologies, then it may well settle about that level. What we really need, and the Committee on Climate Change say this, is for it to go down to 50 or less on average, so that low carbon electricity that it can then start to supply electric vehicles and heat pumps and other things. So there's some way to go, but we've certainly made a huge amount of progress there. And that is really illustrated again by this CCT graph showing that this is what they think in terms of generation in future might be needed. It's about a year old, is this graph, so it's probably could be updated now. But they're basically saying there are some plans in the pipeline, such as on offshore wind in dark colors there. That level of ambition has increased. Government announced that. So we would have 40 gigawatts of offshore wind perhaps coming on stream, so a large amount. But there's this red bit at the top, which is the policy gap. That's stuff which hasn't really been contracted. And you see the other point that's happening, which we can discuss in the Q&A perhaps, is that nuclear share is actually going to fall over time because a lot of the older stations are closing and there's only one station at the moment being built, one new one. And there isn't, as far as I can tell, any commitment in the spending review yet to a definite plan to go ahead with any further nuclear stations. Of the current design, there's research money for new generations in there, but that will take time to bear fruit. So that's the story with power. So this is where I'm going to go to my first Slido poll. So if you bear with me, I'm just going to switch to the screen share, and the same question should come up when I share you with the Slido poll. So I hope you can see that. So I've got the poll up here. So this is a poll where you can vote for as many options as you like. Okay, so you don't just have to vote for one of them. And it's basically which electricity generation technologies should the UK prioritise to make that further progress with emissions reduction. So you can vote for one, you can vote for two, you can vote for all of them if you wish. But those are the choices there. So I'll give you a bit of time to put your votes in, and then we'll see where we end up in terms of ordering. And then I'm also going to show you what the Climate Assembly thought in terms of its own deliberations as well. So I'll just give it a bit of time for people to vote. Thank you. So we're up to, maybe I'll wait till it goes over at least 50. The numbers seem to be settling down. Okay, so that's, yeah, really interesting. I had no idea how you were going to come up with the sort of ordering. The ordering doesn't seem to be changed. There's a few more people vote, but clearly very clear lead for offshore wind. I guess, perhaps influenced by, the progress that's been made with that technology and the potential in the UK. But then we've got quite a cluster in the middle of solar, onshore wind, wave and tidal, quite close together. Nuclear, then there's a little bit of a step down, so 38%, hydro on 33%, and then we've got bioenergy, geothermal, I think carbon capture and storage on 11% at the bottom there. So thank you. So a very clear leader in terms of preference, and then sort of middle cluster, but really tailing off quite a lot to particularly to carbon capture at the end, but also less people prioritizing bioenergy and the geothermal as well. So thank you very much. So I'm going to just stop that share as well now and go back to my presentation slides. Yeah. I hope you can see that. So I will now show you, this is taken straight from the Climate Assembly UK report slide pack. You can see it's really interesting that what you came up with, I mean, the question asked was quite different. So they were asking about individual technologies. To what extent do you support or not a particular technology? So there was a more nuanced polling and also a lot of opportunity for them to talk about why they felt the way they did. But there were particularly strong support for the same three technologies that came at the top of your poll, offshore wind, solar and onshore wind, although the gap of offshore wind to the other two was not as big for Climate Assembly. These were the reasons the Climate Assembly members gave for why they thought those technologies were particularly worth supporting. They liked the fact they were proven clean and low cost. They liked offshore wind being out of the way, at least some of them did. and they like the flexibility of solar in terms of locating it within urban areas, for example. They were also unsure about those the other three technologies, and again, let them 50% support, rather like in your own poll. So bioenergy, nuclear, and fossil fuels with carbon capture. Bioenergy, there was a lot of discussion about sustainability and how it's produced and how it's used and what resources are used. So I think maybe a lot of conditions attached there. Nuclear, some concerns about cost and safety and where the waste would be stored. And then for fossil fuels and CCS, a lot of questions. We got a lot of questions about safety of carbon storage. And we tried to give the best evidence possible about what was going on already around the world, but clearly the Assembly members felt that was a concern for them. But also the continued use of fossil fuels is something that bothered at least many of them, and that's why that had lower levels of support. So that's the first poll in contrast, which is not too far apart in terms of what you said and what they said. So I'm now going to move on to the next area of challenge, which is homes. And again, I think I've got another poll for you there. So energy efficiency in homes is clearly a big challenge. Well, I certainly count myself among this. We live in homes which are sometimes quite old, sometimes quite drafty. And this time of year, you start to feel the disbenefits of living in an old drafty home, despite your best efforts with your heating system. So we have done a lot again in the past to insulate and upgrade many of our homes. So this is a graph from BEIS, the government department responsible, showing how many measures have been installed historically, going right back to 2008. So you can see it's a whole period in the 8 to around 2012 when we were installing a lot of loft insulation measures, cavity walls, etc. But that's really dropped off as we replaced one policy mechanism with another. So we ended up with the Green Deal, which some of you may have heard of, partly for the wrong reasons in that it didn't really work very well, and ECO, which is an obligation on energy suppliers to do things particularly for fuel poor, low income homes. So they are still installing measures, around 200,000 measures a year, but that's far fewer than used to be installed in the early 2010s, late 2000s. So we've got a long way to go. We need to do a lot of external insulation and that kind of thing. So there's a lot to do. And that's really partly why the Committee on Climate Change are marking the government hard in terms of assessing them in this area. They feel a lot more needs to be done on this area. Again, in the 10-point plan, there was confirmation that the new scheme, the Green Homes Grant, which people have found it very difficult to access, is going to be extended. A bit of new money in there as well. But the impact of that grant to get your home insulated by heat pumps, that kind of thing, may be better now with that upgrade. But at the same time, we obviously have to decarbonize our heating systems as well. It's not just about insulation. And that was very clear in the 10-point plan as well, and something the Committee on Climate Change talks about a lot too. So on the one hand, we have heat pumps. Here are the two main candidates. Of course, there's a third, which is district heating in dense urban areas, which you can do if it's low carbon. But you've got heat pumps, and then hydrogen, which is exemplified by a diagram about one of the trials. And having sort of read my history about electricity a long time ago now, it sort of reminds me of reading that history. In the early days of electricity, there was really a battle, in this case, between different types of electricity systems, between AC, alternating current, which is what we use, and direct current, which is kind of what's used in some of our devices, and between the inventors of those systems and the promoters about which one was going to be used. And I feel we're sort of in a version of a current war at the moment. We've got different industrial lobbies saying hydrogen is the answer, and others saying, no, that's pie in the sky, we need heat pumps. And actually, I think it may be the case we need both, but I think that there is a need for certainly learning a lot more, and I think that's what the 10-point plan has done, which is a good thing, is actually more emphasis on deploying more heat pumps, which are more proven, and then getting some of the trials going to really see whether hydrogen is going to deliver what proponents think it will. So, at the moment, heating that's part of the uncertainty, and the reason why it's going to take some time is that we don't quite know which options to use and how and in what areas. I think the other challenge is that we can only learn to a certain extent from other countries in heat. You see this graph. This is about the heat mix for residential heating in different countries. And the thing I wanted to direct you to was the right-hand side, where the UK and the Netherlands are, where most of our heating is from natural gas, or fossil gas, as other people call it. Whereas if you go to other countries, they've got more of a mix. They've got district heating, they've got electricity, and so on. So we've got a challenge we share with some countries, but not with others, which is how do we move away from an existing system, which is a very well-developed gas network. People have gas boilers, they like them. So how do we move from that to other types of technology, which have costs involved and are quite different to use? And that's where I'm going to come in with the next poll, the second of the three I'm going to show you. So this is just, there isn't a right answer, just like with the last one to this one, but it's just to get you all to look into your crystal ball and to say, you know, to make a point, you can only vote for one option this time. So how do you think the majority, so not all necessary, but the majority of UK homes will be heated in a net zero future? Assuming we meet all our targets, how do you think we're going to heat our homes? Is it going to be electric heat pumps? Or is it going to be boilers, but with hydrogen instead of natural gas? Or are we going to be all using low carbon district heating systems, or at least most of us? So I'm just going to, while you're deciding on your vote, I'll stop sharing and get the poll up for that one. And just put on to the next one. So there we go. So how will the majority of UK homes be heated in a net zero future? So off you go. Again, it's the majority, it doesn't necessarily have to be 100%. So far, a very interesting result. At least I sort of, well, I won't say anything just while the last few people vote. Oh. Yeah, settling down now. I kind of expected a bit more of a split, even or closer to even split between the first two, you know, so many more of you than I perhaps expected have gone for the majority on electric heat pumps. But of course, many of you might have in mind that that might be most, but actually we still have hydrogen and district heating alongside, but for a smaller proportion of households. So that's for me the very interesting thing in terms of your results, and still quite a few district heating and hydrogen boilers. So I will stop the share because I think the poll's settled down now, and go back to the slides. And show you, again, this is taken directly from the Climate Assembly. So one interesting thing is that the results are actually presented quite differently from the Climate Assembly. So they did, some of the Assembly members spent a lot of time getting evidence and deliberating on how to decarbonise homes. But actually a lot of their discussion was more about the how should we do this, not in terms of which technologies, but in terms of how you might deliver it, the consumer experience, consumer protection, what sort of policy incentives you might need, that kind of thing. So a lot of their recommendations focus on all those other things. What's really interesting, looking at the bottom left of this slide, is that actually they express some quite high levels of support in principle for all of those three options that I've shown you on the poll just now. So their support for hydrogen, for heat pumps, for heat networks were around the 80% level. They were, you know, pretty supportive of all of them. Quite interestingly, they felt that actually it would be up to local areas and individuals to decide which combination of options would work best in which areas. But they also wanted to minimize disruption, quite understandably. So actually, if it could all be done in one go, efficiency, heating, and all of the things, rather than people coming to your house again and again, that would be better. And they also wanted choice and flexibility. And then you can see some of their other recommendations on the right-hand side. It's a very brief snapshot, but they're very much interested in changes to product standards, consumer protection, support for trusted organizations to do the work, and local plans as well. And they were in favor of a ban on sales of new gas boilers from 2030 or 2035. So that sort of mirrors the ban on diesel and petrol cars. That's not something the government has taken up yet, although they have consulted on a ban on gas boilers in new homes, and that's likely to come in somewhere between 2023 and 2025. I think, at least that's my understanding at the moment. So that's heating and energy efficiency. And this is just a summary. I've said most of this already, but there is a certain amount in the 10-point plan. And then there's a heat and building strategy. I've just put coming soon, because who knows whether it's coming before Christmas or after. But I think we can expect a lot more detail about these headlines and the plan for getting there when that is published. So we can talk about that more in questions, perhaps. Carbon capture and storage is another area that they talked about. Now, clearly, if you're going to move to hydrogen for heating and you're going to continue to use natural gas for that hydrogen, then carbon capture and storage is important. Carbon capture and storage is also potentially important for decarbonising industry. Now, at the moment, things are starting to move again on that. I think for quite a while, quite a few years, we've had the kind of things I've shown you on this slide, lots of meetings with ministers and commissions, producing reports saying this is how we think we should introduce carbon capture, we should support it, but not a lot in terms of firm commitments. We've had a few times when governments put money on the table, but it hasn't really worked out. We've not had a full-scale demonstration. I've doctored this FT headline because it was 800 million. Now, there's, as a result of last week, there's £1 billion on the table once again for this technology. And the government wants to support up to 4 zero carbon clusters with carbon capture infrastructure through that fund. It still, I think, remains to be seen how that's going to be delivered. We've had these announcements before, so I tend to be slightly jaded about this, but I hope this time round it might deliver. But going back to the Climate Assembly's conclusions on electricity, I think there is a public engagement challenge here as well because of the low levels of support amongst the public for this technology. Yet many of us experts say this is essential to meet net zero. So there's certainly a challenge there for government and for the companies that want to deliver this particular technology. I think the final topic I'm going to cover before I finish is transport. I think it's very important from the reasons I mentioned earlier. Fairly flat emissions that haven't changed. It's very diverse, as I've showed you here. This is a breakdown from 2017. I think it's probably similar, 2018, 2019. It includes our international air travel and shipping. That's why the data is a little bit old, because that often lags the national data. So that's why air travel is so much a big part of that pie, because it's all our international flights are in there as well as the domestic ones. And shipping's in there for the same reason. So, there's a lot of different challenges, but clearly cars and vans is about 50% of the emissions. And so that phase out of electric, of petrol and diesel vehicles is going to have a big impact. This is some work done by colleagues at the UK Energy Research Centre, which I used to be director of, which was before we had that recent 2030 phase-out ban, just looking at what would happen if we had such a ban. And I will go through it only briefly. There's a nice, I think, briefing on the UK Energy Research Centre website, which summarises this, but basically saying what would we need to do if we were really going to get the fair share of cars and van emissions down to a sort of net zero compatible level, which is really the red dotted line at the bottom. So the previous UK government target here at the top in green would have taken us to this red line, the top red line there. So it's going to reduce emissions, but nowhere near enough. Whereas if you have, I think it's the this blue line, so you have the ban in 2030, although this includes hybrids, which haven't been included until 2035, then you can get close to it. So I think government may have to include the hybrids, which will be tough given that the car industry are quite opposed to this if they really want to get those vehicle emissions down enough to be compatible with net zero. So I think there's still questions about whether it's quite compatible with the target yet, but certainly we're a lot closer than we were before. And then finally on surface transport and electric vehicles, clearly that's going to have a big impact on the electricity sector. This is some scenarios from National Grid, just showing that there's a rise in the peak demand on electricity over time. And they published 4 scenarios for that. That's why there's 4 different lines, because the future may be different. And some of that rise is due to electric vehicles. A really important point they make every year is that the rise in demand for electricity and the amount of electricity we might need in terms of power station capacity will be much higher if we don't charge vehicles in a smart way and a flexible way. If we do it in a flexible way, we can end up with a lower peak in demand. So the cost of that system is going to be much less. And clearly, again, there's quite a long way to go until we're there, but lots of things going on in terms of company innovation, new tariffs, etc., to really try and bring that smartness into the system. And this will bring me just to the final poll, and I'm going to now change gear onto air travel. So that's another area, and I'll show you the Citizens Assembly's conclusions on that in a moment. But you know, I thought about this, and I thought, well, this might be the best way to frame a poll. So I'm really asking you, what should be the main priority? So it's not the only priority, but the main priority for tackling air travel emissions, again, to help meet this net zero target. First option is significantly reducing the amount we fly. So that's a real emphasis on reducing our demand for air travel when, of course, we're allowed to do it again in the usual way. The second option is continuing to fly, perhaps even growing the amount that we fly, but investing in new technologies and fuels, whether it's electric planes or synthetic fuels to reduce emissions. And the third is continuing, but investing in removals. That should say greenhouse gas removals, not greenhouse has removals. That's a typo. But so it's kind of letting emissions go from air travel, but actually taking them out through removals, through direct air capture or tree planting or other measures. So once again, and for the last time, I'll just change to the other screen so we can see where your votes are coming out. Right, so there we go. So away, and then we'll see where we get to. Okay, good. I'll just wait for another few votes to come in. Okay, so I think it's sort of settling down. So most of you have gone for the first option, at least as your preference, as your main priority, which is reducing the demand. But quite a lot of you are supportive of the investing in new technologies and fuels. And that's, again, certainly something that came up in the 10-point plan. There's a zero aviation or zero flight challenge that I think the Prime Minister has launched with a rather ambitious target for getting a zero carbon transatlantic flight, I think by 2025, if I'm remembering correctly, which is extremely ambitious in terms of where technology is, but certainly quite a big emphasis on that middle option. And some emphasis actually on that third option, even though not many of you have gone for it, of investing in greenhouse gas removals as well. So thanks for participating in those polls. So just go back to the slides for the last few points now. So again, I'll just briefly summarize where the Climate Assembly UK came out. They were offered a whole range of different scenarios that covered combinations of those options you've been asked to vote on. And where they came out was they wanted some growth to be allowed in air passenger numbers, but not as much as historically. So 25 to 50% sounds like a lot by 2050, but actually it's a lower annual rate of growth than we've had in the last 20 years. And depending on the speed of technology. So they would still have to have a lot of removals, 30 million tons by 2050. They want investment in alternatives, particularly high-speed rail and that kind of thing for continental, intercontinental flights, you know, flights to Spain, that kind of thing. We also discussed, which I couldn't obviously include in the simple question I gave, how that might be done. So we gave them options about taxes, and they certainly liked the idea of taxing people who fly more at a higher rate than people who fly less, but also as they fly further. Investment in greenhouse gas removals and in the development of new technologies. They were very, very keen on that. So even though they wanted the sort of taxes to help bring demand down, they wanted that investment in new technology as well. So I guess they're not necessarily agreeing with one of the three options that you gave. So there's an element of all three in there. And then finally, that takes me on to my sort of very last topic. Oops, I've just slipped a slide, which is negative emissions. It's partly not just energy, of course. It's about the broader agriculture, how we manage our forestry and so on. But it does seem, you know, it is very important for meeting net zero for the UK and the world as a whole. there's very much, I think, from the 10-point plan, and this guy, Dominic Cummings, who he's no longer in number 10, but certainly had quite a lot of influence on some of the more technological things in the 10-point plan, I'm sure. And one of the things he was particularly enthusiastic about was direct air capture technology. So government is funding some early stage technology development in that area. Which may or may not commercialize. At the moment, it's very expensive, but also there's pilots of bioenergy with carbon capture, including at the large Drax power generation site in Yorkshire. And then lots of commitments by both government and companies to things like afforestation, planting trees, which clearly we know how to do, and we know how to manage if we do it carefully enough. So that will need to continue to be a big part of what we need to do. And again, finally, just I thought I'd give the Climate Assembly the last word on this. They also voted on those options. The interesting thing there, just to summarize what they said, is that they really came out in favor of what's called the nature-based solutions. So that's forest management, restoring certain habitats like peatland, so that they lock away carbon, and wetlands, using wood in construction. Again, that's another way of locking away carbon. So they like those, partly because of their co-benefits, and they were seen as natural and perhaps, at least in some cases, easier. They had limited support for bioenergy with carbon capture and direct air capture. I think the link to CCS meant the same issues came up as with carbon capture and storage more generally, but also they were worried that they weren't proven enough, and could we rely? But then again, some Assembly members were very supportive about further R&D. So I think some of them would certainly be supportive of what the government is now doing. So that's as much as I wanted to say. That brings me to the end of this tour. So I hope it's been useful. I think my central message is that, you know, we have done quite well. And I think when government ministers stand up, and they will do a lot over the next 12 months in the run up to the COP, and trumpet the achievements of the UK, I think that's a fair thing to do. But I think at the same time, they do need to tell a story about how the UK is going to the next stage of dealing with those harder sectors, the heat, the industry, the transport, the negative emissions, and really put the money where their mouth is. You know, the 10-point plan is really worthwhile, but it doesn't fill, you know, the gaps we have that the Committee on Climate Change have identified. But certainly it's, you know, we are moving in the right direction, and thinking where we are in terms of the economic stress we're under and the pressure on government budgets and so on. I am not entirely optimistic, but at least cautiously, that at least we are doing some of the things that need to be done. But we do need to do a lot more, and we really need to double down on that green recovery narrative that was there with the 10-point plan. But I think there's a lot more government could do to support that side of the economy. So thank you very much for listening and participating, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was fascinating. I was particularly like sort of the emphasis on the interrelatedness of the task ahead of us and bridging this gap. That's a societal but also economic and a policy-driven task ahead of us. We do have a few questions. First off, we had Emily, who had a question on carbon offsetting, if she wanted to unmute herself and ask it. If not.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Jim, for a really interesting speech and gallop through what the recent work's been coming up with. There was one slide I particularly wanted to ask you about, on where you covered carbon offsets. Partly, I wasn't sure what proportion of reductions in emissions would be expected before carbon offsets were being permitted, if you see what I mean. In terms of, is there a trade-off there in the decision-making process you're aware of currently? So is there the use of carbon offsets, is it constrained only to offset hard-to-abate emissions, for example? And given that this is a climate-driven process, will the co-benefits, but also co-concerns, I noticed as a question just now about the impacts on agriculture and food production, that's true with afforestation projects for carbon offsets and nature-based solutions, for example, but obviously nature-based solutions also offer biodiversity benefits. And I had a third point to this. Is the UK looking to just buy carbon offsets from overseas, or are we going to constrain that our carbon offsets can only happen within the UK? So are we taking responsibility, basically? Thanks.
No, thank you. I think those are very good questions. And I didn't, certainly just partly because of time, didn't spend enough time really emphasizing that connection between meeting the net zero target and the way we use land and policies and what we do about agriculture and biodiversity and all those other things. And I think that's the real difference with net zero when you compare it to when we used to be in a world where we had an 80% reduction target, where we didn't really have to think as hard about those things, and we do now. I think, again, you've usefully unpacked the point about carbon offset. So personally, and I think the Committee on Climate Change's advice has been strong on this, I think we should be offsetting or having negative emissions if we need it within the UK. So in other words, not relying on buying in credits or offsets from other countries in order to balance our emissions. You know, tempting though that is, I think if we're really committed to decarbonisation and leadership globally, then we should be doing as much as we can, A, to reduce emissions before we use the negative emissions, and then B, if we want to use them, we use them domestically. And that's not, you know, because domestic is better, but it's a sort of moral thing, really. And so I think that's important. I think the government itself has hedged its bets a little bit more. I think there is, as far as I understand the legislation and its position, flexibility to use those offsets. So I don't think I've seen a really firm commitment that says we will definitely not use them, or even a conditional one that says we'll only use them to offset particular sectors. But those are the kind of thorny questions we're really going to have to tackle as things progress further in where we go. And you're absolutely right that, you know, if this starts putting more emphasis, as it will, on things like tree planting and using land differently, which is something that, you know, perhaps we can do more easily in principle after leaving the EU, because we don't get tied into the common agricultural policy anymore, then we think about that in the round. So it's carbon, you know, storage alongside biodiversity, alongside food production and other things. So, you know, talking to the Committee on Climate Change, a lot of this comes down to how we manage the land and what's the way in which we want to manage that land, not just for climate reasons, energy production, food production, and just for nature and biodiversity. So great opening question, thank you.
Great question, thank you. So I have a question from Louis Kofe, if he would like to ask his question, or I'll ask it for him.
Yeah, I'll have a go. Thanks for a great presentation, Jim. I just wondered, on the kind of social science behavior side, what does good practice look like in terms of reducing demand? And that can be across any of the different energy uses. I put an example in there around transport. So for example, how do you reduce the number of flights that people take or the number of car journeys? But I just wondered, looking around the world, what does good practice look like?
Yeah, that's a very good, a very broad question. So I might answer it rather than in the general by talking about that specific area you've asked about. And actually within the Climate Assembly, we did discuss this a lot, and the Assembly heard evidence on international examples of, for example, how do you try and get people to travel around differently, whether it be using cycling more and walking, but also better public transport networks and that kind of thing. I think certainly in that area, good practice is partly about access to alternatives. And access can be that they are present. You know, a lot of the Assembly members, talking to them, were saying, well, in my area of the UK, it's very hard to get this kind of integration of transport, especially if they're not in an urban area, so that I can be sure I can leave my house and get a bus and then a train and whatever to where I need to go very easily and regularly, and then get back again. So I just need a car. And so, you know, I just say that to illustrate that access to alternatives it makes a big difference. And they heard evidence from, and I'm just from memory going now, I think there was a city in France, there was examples from the Netherlands, Scandinavia, where you got much more integrated solutions there. And so if you go to their website, you can see all the presentations that were given just on that particular topic, and that will include those examples. So I think, you know, if you think across the board, that's quite an important general point, is that yes, you can do the information and give people information and exhort people that it's good for you or good for the planet to do X, Y, Z to reduce demand. But actually often, you know, they might need money, they may need resources, they may need access to alternatives in order to reduce, say, the use of cars. And then, of course, at some point, you will also need, and again, the Climate Assembly discussed this extensively, sort of what you might call harder measures or incentives, you know, whether it be taxation changes for flying or, you know, outright regulations. But in terms of regulations, in terms of, say, car use or buying cars, that is not necessarily going to reduce demand, is it? It's actually just going to mean that they use different cars to get around. Whereas they also heard about road pricing, where that might start to moderate congestion and use. So I think it may be good practice in theory, and there may be some really good trials around, which there are, but I think for politicians, those options, the taxation options, are ones that they get more nervous about, put it that way. Our case from the Assembly was that the fact Assembly members thought, for example, a frequent flyer levy type of tax had quite a lot of support, maybe should give policymakers more confidence to use those kind of measures. So I suppose in summary, it's not all about voluntarism and information, but actually you need other things, access to alternatives, incentives, and those kind of things. And it really will vary a lot by sector and by activity.
Thank you.
May I come in here?
Yeah, go ahead, Leon.
Hello, Jim. This is quite amazing. It must have been about 30 years ago when, in fact, we met. You did finally a project with me on a small wind turbine in a wind tunnel. So it's lovely to see you again after so much.
And you, it's an unforgettable experience, Leon. So it's wonderful to see you again.
Right. So I would actually just want to make a contribution from my own experience. I've tried, of course, to get us to make myself as green as possible. So I've got solar panels and I've got a fully electric car. The problem, of course, that I want to tackle is the problem of house heating. And we've got an ordinary gas boiler, you know, fitting both the radiators and the hot water cylinder. So I had recently an installer of heat pumps to come and have a look at the possibility of converting my system into a heat source, you know, system. Very difficult. Well, first, retrofitting something in a house, an old house, of course, is practically impossible because the heat pumps will actually produce a water at 50 degrees, which is perfectly all right if you've got underfloor heating. But we've got, of course, 60 million houses in the UK, practically all of them, with water heating systems. Apparently, there is now a manufacturer of heat pumps that will produce water at 70 degrees. Which I was, you know, very excited about. But when this guy came and had a look at the house, it required such enormous complications in actually converting the present central heating system to one with a heat pump that produces 70 degrees. So it was, in spite of my best desire, it just couldn't be done. However, I came to another conclusion, and that's you can actually buy air conditioning units, which of course are quite available and very easily installed. These are air-to-air air conditioning units, which are usually used for cooling, but in fact they produce heat as well. So if people are prepared to have several of those around the house, something like 3 or 4 substantial size units, you could actually use the idea of heat pumps, but from air-to-air system with very little alteration to the remaining system. So I just wondered whether this is something that people have thought of. Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Leon, and yeah, so really nice to see you after all these years, and to hear the upgrades you've been doing. I'm not sure, but I'm absolutely familiar with the challenge that you mentioned. In that one of the points about, you know, changing your heating system to a heat pump is that it's not just a case of taking the boiler out and putting the heat pump in. Often there are consequential changes to the heating system, you know, the radiators, and ideally, like you said, you'd have underfloor heating. And I think for some homes, that means that the costs can be very high. I mean, I know people who've done it, but they have been very much pioneers with access to that kind of capital. So I do think if we are going to move many homes over to that kind of system, some it'll be easier, then from many households, they are going to need financial help. There are going to need to be, you know, trusted installers who can do this with all of the you know, knowledge and skills that they need. But I haven't really come across the idea of using the, you know, decentralized air conditioning unit system that you mentioned. So I'd have to defer to specialist colleagues, but I will ask them next time I talk to them. There's a lot of UCL colleagues working in this area, so I will, and I'll drop you a line if that's all right.
You know, one buys those things basically for cooling mostly, but in fact, there are very good heating systems as well. I've got one installed in a bedroom because of the substantial heat we had last summer, and it is quite an amazing source of good heat. And of course, they've got efficiencies of 300, 400%. So that in fact, for every unit of electricity you use, you get 3 or 4 units of heat. So I cannot see why a multiplicity of those in a household will not be a better solution, certainly much less invasive. Anyway, that's my contribution. Okay, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. This leads on quite nicely to a question from Richard H. I don't know if you want to talk about building standards and the prospect of building zero carbon homes in the next year or two.
Oh, hi. Yes. Sorry. Yeah, my name's Richard Harding. I'm a climate scientist, but also involved in the Friends of the Earth campaign to persuade government to get on and build zero carbon houses. We're building 250,000 houses a year in this country. I noticed you flagged up the future homes part as being green. Well, the government have been sitting on this for a year now and seem to be making no progress in tightening up the building regulations. And given that they have history of abandoning zero carbon homes back in 2015, do you have a feel for the prospect of whether there's any appetite in the government to actually start forcing the builders to build zero carbon homes?
Yeah, it's a very good question. You're absolutely right. The history on this hasn't been good. You know, the abandoning of that pledge previously, the fact that many of the homes being built now are not, you know, zero carbon. They're still putting in heating systems, which will need to be then taken out, you know, to be compatible with net zero. The build quality is often not good enough, as far as I understand it, from colleagues who work in this area. And I think, you know, from some work that we did when I was at the UK Energy Research Centre, one of the big issues, it's partly government and their willingness to take on the construction sector and the house builders. And I think, you know, historically, they haven't been willing to take them on, but I think they're going to need to. But I think there's also linked to skills and capabilities within the supply chain of that construction sector. So some great work done at the University of Oxford when I was at the UK Energy Research Centre by Gavin Killip, but also with colleagues at Leeds, really looking at that sector and what are the things that they really needed to do to be compatible with net zero. So in terms of their skills, the way the supply chain works and everything else. It was a really quite a sad read in one way, but it also gave you some clues as to what would need to be done. So I think, yes, the government does need to do a lot more to regulate properly, but I think there is, and it's true for retrofitting as well, there's a big piece of work to be done to improve the skills of that whole set of trades, so they're not so atomized. They can come along and do integrated upgrades to existing homes or deliver the new homes to the standard we need. I'm sensing that the department responsible for construction, MHCLG, is sort of coming from the cold a little bit. I'm not saying it's solved, but I'm hearing them talked about in a bit more favorably these days, put it that way. That's probably as far as I'm prepared to go, because there was a time after the zero carbon homes thing when, you know, many people had just given up on them as really being serious about this area. My sense is that's starting to change, but the proof will be in what the government actually does, of course.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Jim. Belinda had a very similar question. I was wondering if you wanted to ask any questions on from that, or whether she's still there.
Hi, I'm still here. Yeah, it was really just to say, what is the government will need to change the planning policy and building regulations, and they show no signs of doing it. The local councils, I'm a town councillor in a small town in the south coast, and we have a lot of people living in big old leaky houses. They can't afford to pay for planning permission even to look at secondary, double glazing and increasing the size of their drain pipes for the amount of rain that we're already getting and are projected to get more of. And there's a huge groundswell of all the groups I'm involved in sort of trying to push upwards to say, look, you really do need to look at the plan, because everything flows from it, doesn't it, planning? Even if you're looking at transport, you need to have the planning regulations to be working towards net carbon zero. And we just don't know the best way to make it happen.
Yeah, that's a really important dilemma. I'm not an expert on planning, I should say first, but I think this is a rather familiar story, again, from work I know of on the role of particularly local government in this area. And, looking at some of the really good examples of local government activism and work, there are some local authorities around the country who've done a lot. And a lot of it comes down to the point you make about, capacity. They do have, whether it be supportive leadership or councillors, but somehow have managed to get a critical mass of officers as well, people who can work on this. Now, clearly, they can only do so much within the current confines of the planning system as it is. I think many people are sort of pleasantly surprised how much can be done, but that needs those resources. And I think, there's been a lot of engagement with central government to say, well, look, you just need to invest in this capacity in local government so that they can do some of these things. And I think, that hasn't got as far as it should have done. The body that I know that's doing a lot of work in this area, and you probably know them already, is UK 100, led by Polly Billington. They're a whole network of local authorities, often the ones that are doing more in this area. But they may be worth getting in touch with. They're a very good network that seem to be doing a lot of interesting work. And they probably have a hell of a lot more knowledge than I do about, just how to get over some of these barriers you mentioned. But I agree, it's really important because local delivery, particularly in the heat in the buildings, but also in the transport areas, is essential if we're going to meet net zero. And to me, that seems important that then local authorities are part of the solution and you need to give them the tools to do that.
Yeah, my question was more about how on earth do we get government to change the planning regulations, because the local authorities really can't operate within, there's no way we can reach net zero with our current planning regulations. And it doesn't seem as if the planning side of government life is talking to the other departments.
Well, we're coming back to our old friend MHCLG again, aren't we? And I've said what I feel about them in a most diplomatic way I could. I probably should leave it there because, as I said, I'm not really an expert on where that is, but I have heard absolutely what you say, that it needs to change.
Thanks.
Cool, thank you very much. And we have another question from Pietro Salvi about food production and agricultural land use. If he's not here, I'll ask it. There are many plans in the natural strategy that involve addressing. Oh, sorry. That's more commenting than something else. We have a question from Geraint Northwood.
Hi. Thanks for the talk, it's really good. I just wanted to ask about basically other planetary boundaries than climate change, and the fact that so a lot of the solutions proposed that are technological basically shift the burdens from climate change onto other planetary boundaries, whether it's through damaging mining of minerals and things like that. And from what I understand, embedding planetary boundary sort of thinking into frameworks for the green transition very early on is very important to get this right. So I'm wondering sort of how much is this being addressed in the Climate Assembly and by the government when they're thinking about climate change?
Yeah, I think, for the Climate Assembly first, in their work, it wasn't necessarily framed as planetary boundaries, but certainly there was a lot of discussion, and I've given you a flavour of some of it, about some of the options which touched on other potential negative impacts. So when they were talking, for example, about biomass power generation, there was, if you look at the detail of what the Assembly said, impacts on biodiversity, impacts on the natural world, etc., were things that they were weighing up when thinking about how far they supported that particular option. Similarly, co-benefits when it came to nature-based solutions in terms of being able to address biodiversity, for example. And lots of questions about the point that you mentioned about, minerals being used in new technologies, whether it be solar, wind, or batteries for electric vehicles, and whether, we weren't just creating a new problem for ourselves by switching that technology. So they were very, very thoughtful about that. You'll find a lot in the detail of the report that bears that out. My sense from government itself, as you look at the sort of central messages within, say, the 10-point plan and their response to the Committee on Climate Change, is more focusing on the greenhouse gas reduction. I haven't seen as much of them thinking it through in that way and thinking about those interdependencies with some of those other planetary boundaries. I do think that thinking is important to embed. I think, I suppose it's a balance, isn't it? It's being able to make some progress to do the things we need to do to reduce emissions, because climate change is urgent, but at the same time doing it in such a way that you try and address as far as possible these other important issues, biodiversity and mineral use. And certainly in the mineral area, the fact that demand for some of those minerals like cobalt, lithium is starting to rise has already started a lot of discussion and work on alternatives, whether it be alternative sources of supply or substitute minerals that we could use if there are scarcity issues, or partly due to the environmental impacts of mining, for example. So I wouldn't want those worries to stop us adopting electric vehicles, for example, but I would certainly want us to go in with our eyes open and think very clearly about those alternatives at the same time. And I'm not seeing a huge amount of evidence in the way the government talks that they've really thought in that more systems way, if you see what I mean.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cool, thank you very much. And we have another Imperial student who wants to ask a question about biofuels. Ryan O'Shea.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, it's just coming back to you mentioned about the conversation and the discussion that went on with sort of like bioenergy and carbon capture. And I sort of wanted to pick that apart in the sense of, is this focused on sort of like first and second generation, or is there sort of the enthusiasm and significant consideration for like third and fourth generation, especially like an algae bioeconomy? And the one I'd ask on the back of that is, should we actually be comparing this against the hydrogen economy for like hard to decarbonize sectors like aviation, especially if fossil fuels are going to produce the energy that would then used? I'm sort of curious to see sort of how this is circulating, especially within the UK context, because I know the US have been quite committed to their sort of bioenergy program with algae and stuff like that. So yeah, it'd be interesting to know.
Yeah, thanks. So I think first, if you're talking about the climate assembly, I think sort of bioenergy was one of those topics where, because of its complexity, you've got the different, whole range of different technologies in that system, haven't you? You've got all the different generations of types of fuel, as you've mentioned, and depending on which pathway, fuel, etc., you're talking about, some of the positive and negative aspects of using them can be completely different as well. Yeah. So I think some of the ambivalence about bioenergy from the assembly in the way that they thought about them, you can see it in the detail, is partly due to them, really grappling with that complexity and thinking, oh, this is quite a difficult topic on which to give a very firm answer one way or the other, because it really does depend, and that's the evidence they heard. And I don't think, frankly, they had enough space and time, given that was one of a number of technologies they were heard about, to really get into the detail to the level you could about being able to make pronouncements on third, fourth generation versus second, for example. Yeah. So, but you will find some comments there. So I think that probably explains some of that ambivalence. I think in terms of other analysis I've seen or stuff we do at UCL, yes, very much we do try and put in, latest information, say if we're modeling things about bioenergy pathways and hydrogen, and you should be comparing those about their full supply chain impacts, and especially if the hydrogen is fossil fuel based. But again, going back to the previous question, you're often not comparing those along one dimension, the carbon supply chain impact, but you've got these other things, or impacts along other dimensions, other planetary boundaries, as the previous questioner put it. So I think, certainly some of the research we do at UCL, and probably the same with Imperial, you're really trying to do this multi-dimensional appraisal of these options. But whether that evidence base is really then getting embedded into decision making, I probably go to my previous answer and say, not sure. There's probably specialists within the civil service who really understand it. There always are, but whether that's really getting up to those senior level decisions. But I think it's really, really, again, important, because I think my observation on hydrogen at the moment is that it's really caught the imagination of senior politicians. You know, they've been lobbied hard, and there's nothing wrong with lobbying. You know, everybody lobbies, and sometimes they lobby for good things and sometimes not. But I think their perception of where hydrogen is has got a bit ahead of the reality as a result. That's my personal view, which is kind of why I emphasize that I'm quite pleased the government said we're going to do some trials and we're going to see how it works. But I really, really hope when they do those trials, we're evaluating not only the does it work technically question, but the cost, the public perception, but also the sustainability in that broad sense you've been talking about as well, and comparing it with other options, because then we've got to have a better sense of whether it's the solution or not. But thanks.
Thank you.
I think it's a good point in addressing that complexity and how all this is all produced. I think that sort of runs on quite well to Richard H's second question about what work is actually necessary to produce truly green hydrogen.
Hi there. Yeah, Patrick's just sort of answered my question, really. I mean, I understand it. There's hydrogen that you mentioned created from methane, which isn't, in my view, a zero carbon fuel, and a green hydrogen made from, I guess, electrolysis of water. I'm no expert on this, but it seems to me that what I call green hydrogen is a long way off yet. And I suppose I'd like your opinion on that. Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not a long way off in being able to do it technically. So, you know, people can electrolyze water, as you said, to generate green hydrogen now. It's just the cost differential between that and what's called blue hydrogen, which is natural gas or fossil gas to hydrogen, which you're absolutely right, that's nowhere near zero emission if you are not capturing the carbon. And even if you are capturing the carbon, processing that gas to split it into CO2 and hydrogen before you use it, you know, it's still not possible to get 100% capture. You know, you're talking 80, 90%, maybe a little bit more. And as you really wanted to squeeze emissions out to get to net zero, clearly even that 90% capture rate is probably not enough. So long term, if we're going to use hydrogen, the green hydrogen route is where we need to be, but there's a real cost differential. So I think there is a lot of work to do. Again, partly why I'm emphasizing the demonstration is not just the system, but it's actually, you know, we need some of those demonstrations to really see whether we can get the costs of that electrolysis route down. So I think it would be a sort of a bad step if all we were doing was demonstrating the blue hydrogen route, and we should actually be demonstrating and trialing the green hydrogen, because it's only by doing will we really see whether those costs can be reduced and it can compete.
Just to follow up, is that in the government proposals, or does it not go into those sort of details?
I think it's a very good question to ask, because often in hydrogen discussions, it's left ambiguous as to what sort of hydrogen you're talking about. You know, I've sat through whole round tables with a minister about hydrogen, and it was only in the last 2 minutes we started talking about where the hydrogen was coming from. So always ask the where is the hydrogen coming from question, because I'm not sure that detail is in there.
Okay, amazing. Thank you very much, Jim. I'm not too sure we have any more questions, unless anyone would want to raise their hand and ask any more now. So I think that's the end of the Q&A for now. We had agreed that there would be a sort of a informal chat afterwards, but I think we've gone over quite a bit on the Q&A. But we will stay around for a little bit longer if people just want to have a opportunity to have a chat. But for now, I would just like to thank Jim. Thank Jim very much for his chat. It's been really interesting and very poignant as we look at the 10-point plan and as we look ahead to COP26, of course, and to the people who ask questions, very insightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody.
Cool. Thank you, Jim.